Thanks very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to come and speak with you and to have discussion about how FDA actually does serve and protect public health. And I've been asked to speak about innovation, and I'm not really expert in innovation per se, but I think my take-home message throughout this is that innovation is good, but the mission of safety and efficacy to make sure that the innovation actually benefits patients and benefits our public health is a central part of what any kind of innovation we do. Speed is not always better unless we come forward with a product that actually works and is, again, safe and effective. And I'm sure you've heard a lot about, I'm going to do a little bit of FDA. You just had FDA 101, and I'll skim quickly through my sort of FDA 101 type of slides, because I think it's always important to hear and learn about sort of the perspective on FDA's role in different ways. And because I come from the point of view of looking at sex and gender differences in safety and efficacy of medical products, looking at women's health, there's a bit of the history of FDA that is intimately tied in with that, because it turns out that FDA's establishment and change in law and policy over the decades has been, unfortunately, often tied to tragedies in safety related to women's health. So I'll talk a bit about that as well. And then talk a little bit about some of the ways we have to make sure we examine any kind of policies going forward, whether it's 21st century cures or anything else, in terms of making sure we don't lose the data that helps us actually assess safety and efficacy across sex, race, ethnicity, age, and so forth. So we're going to try and use this. Okay, great. So I come from George Washington University, just a few miles down the road. That's sort of a fuzzy image of our relatively new School of Public Health building. Those of you interested in public health, it's actually got a lot going on there. And as you've already heard, I think FDA is always, you have to consider it as a place where law, science, and other things sort of intersect. It is not a research agency. It is an agency based on the laws passed by Congress. It can do no more or no less than the authority granted it by Congress. So don't expect it to do things that it doesn't have the legal authority to do, which most people think it can do this or that, and sometimes it just can't as an agency. It also is required under the law to make its decisions based on science. And this is done through both internal evaluation, as you've probably heard, by the reviewers, and external evaluation, sometimes by advisory committees, and certainly by public input. And then it's also influenced by its mission to protect the public health. And this can be, considered, perhaps a gray area, but it does have a strong public health mission. And we have to actually protect it from politics coming in and influencing decision making. You don't make decisions at FDA because it will create new jobs in somebody's congressional district or state, the way you might decide to put a road in. You make the decisions for FDA based on the science and the data presented to the FDA. Again, not just, it has to actually come to the FDA for decisions. So it does have this very strong public health mission to ensure that products are safe and effective and that they comply with all the laws. And as you probably heard, it is responsible for over a quarter of the consumer dollars, and now includes tobacco with the new Center for Tobacco Products. The types of public health activities are broad, and again, you've probably heard about this in the previous presentations, but it's not just reviewing and approving new drugs. That's a big piece of its job, but it has to look at manufacturing, it has to do field inspections, it has to have oversight as much as it can over drug advertising, it has to recall defective products, it has all of these other public health activities in terms of managing drug shortages, information for the public, and so forth. So it's got a huge and broad mission and responsibility, and it's both broad and deep. There are some things it doesn't do. It does, as was mentioned earlier about off-label marketing, it does not regulate the practice of medicine. What it regulates is drug company or medical product marketing, not the practice of medicine by physicians or other clinicians. So that's handled at the state level or by professional boards, professional associations, and so forth. So it has its very defined roles, but it's huge. And I'll say right here and now, it doesn't have the resources it needs. FDA folk can't say that. I'll say it. It needs more money, and not necessarily in user fees, but in actual direct taxpayer dollars. It is a part of the executive branch. It has a very large staff. Most of them are indeed scientifically trained. Many physicians, other clinicians, chemists, statisticians, other scientifically trained folk who manage the whole process, do the inspections and so forth. And it's regulating a huge part of the economy. It does work under these laws I mentioned, multiple versions of different laws. We have the FD&C Act, we have the Public Health Services Act, and then it's interpreted, and we also have the user fee laws, PDUFA, MDUFA, GDUFA, all the user fee laws, right? And then, of course, all of these are interpreted in regulation and guidance put out by the agency. They have this, they came about because the idea was to minimize risk to subjects and to maximize, for products that are approved, efficacy versus any kind of safety or risk. And so these have to be determined sort of, again, first by protecting subjects. That's why we also have the staged early approach. And then when you're actually, we don't want to be testing things that are actually toxic. They have to have been tested in animals first and before you put them into people. And then once you have it into people, you need to start developing the data that shows the safety and efficacy balance. That risk-benefit balance is one that is worth putting this product on the market. And as I pointed out, a lot of, oftentimes that legal change came about due to some tragedy or impact on women's health or reproductive health. If we look back at the history of the FDA, it used to be part of the agriculture department, and it was about adulterated foods and drugs. This was children's health that led to sort of the adulterated foods and patent medicines that were out there on the product, and it was about labeling what was in it, what is actually there. Is it mostly alcohol, which a lot of tonics were, and so that but it didn't have really sort of any kind of enforcement, and there was no safety testing required at all. Now, by the time we get to 1938, we had another child's health disaster. This was sulfanilamide, which was one of the first highly effective antibiotics, a real game changer. But it was put in, was to make it by a pharmacist to make it palatable for children. They put it in some sweet-tasting syrup. Well, that sweet-tasting syrup happened to be diethylene glycol, which is highly toxic. And it killed kids, mostly kids, because there had been no pre-market safety requirements. I believe the pharmacist indeed committed suicide. I mean, this was a terrible tragedy, but it led to the FD&C Act requiring pre-market safety testing, shifting the burden to the manufacturer. Not sort of let the buyer beware, but now the manufacturer has to show some safety, and you still can't have misleading statements. But there still was no risk-benefit assessment, so it was still sort of very vague and very limited in the ability to enforce this. We then jump all the way to 1962, which is the Thalidomide Disaster, and this really started getting into women's reproductive health, where we had severe fetal abnormalities for children born who were exposed to thalidomide in utero. This was approved in Europe, and it then was under application to the United States. It was blocked by Dr. Frances Kelsey, a true hero and brilliant woman who just recently passed away this past summer, who who actually was her, there are lots of good stories here. She came to Washington as an MD PhD with her husband, who I believe worked at NIH, and she couldn't get a job being a female MD PhD, so she took this job with this then quite small federal agency known as the FDA. Her first portfolio, her first application she was given was supposed to be an easy one, and it was thalidomide. And so she started looking at it, and she was an outstanding scientist and physician, and she looked at the data and thought, this is, what was submitted, and she just thought it was completely inadequate, and began to ask questions, asking for more information, insisting on more information. She was accused by the company of bureaucratic slowdown. Terrible. It's approved already in Europe. Why can't we have it here? This is a lovely product. During that delay, FDA was, this product, thalidomide, was shown to have these devastating impacts. And so only a few children were born in the United States with deformities caused by thalidomide. And she herself was then given a presidential medal by President Kennedy up on Cape Cod. This story broke the way they often, and change happened the way it still happens today. So we can learn a lesson from that. The Washington Post ran a big story about, FDA doctor prevents, disasters in children. And that front page story led to, all of a sudden, Congress taking up legislation which had been sort of hanging about for a while, and the President Kennedy, all of a sudden becoming a bit more interested in passage of what are known as the Kefauver-Harris amendments of the FD&C. And those amendments really began to require safety and effectiveness testing, put into this risk-benefit balance requirement. You had to characterize your drug, and that required labeling for the intended use. So a few more teeth got added to FDA's authority in 1962 because of this pregnancy-related product that had such devastating effects on the offspring when exposed. Another disaster occurred which led to regulation of devices. This was the Dalcon Shield. This was one of the early IUDs prior to in the 60s and 70s. There were actually quite a number of IUDs on the market, like 20, lots and lots. They were just manufactured and sold and marketed, and FDA had no regulation of medical devices. But this particular product had a very bad design. It had a sort of a string that kind of wicked possible contamination into the uterus, leading to infection, pelvic inflammatory disease, and some deaths. And so this led to passage, only in 1976, still not that long ago, the first regulation of medical devices. And so this, has, and it has different laws and standards for medical devices, but it wouldn't have really happened if it hadn't been for the Dalcon Shield disaster. Now, again, you probably have heard of this, so I'm going to swing right past it, about the approval process, the fact that it is reviewed by a multidisciplinary team at FDA. Again, this is the type of staff that FDA have working on products, and they actually look at the primary data. As was mentioned, in Europe, the reviewers there don't have the ability and the capacity and the resources to actually look at primary data. They look only at the summary of data presented to them by the sponsor. So, whereas why FDA is the gold standard in the world is because it does take bring the expertise and the resources to bear to actually review the primary data, as well as assess it for validity and look at the chemistry and so forth and so on. So there is a reason why FDA is the gold standard internationally. We have this drug development process, which again, I'm sure you've heard all about, all the different points where FDA comes in. A lot of all this white space is where the sponsors are doing their work. And the FDA comes in at the beginning with the first IND, and then looks at it again when the data is being reviewed. Of course, having lots of conversations with the sponsors about the requirements and recommendations in the meanwhile. Okay, again, we have these phases, which I am not going to talk about. Two things I want to point out, though, and this gets into sort of my thesis that we have to make sure that the data is enough to really assess safety and efficacy. So any of these expedited or fast-tracked or any new processes, we really have to make sure they still hit a standard that's going to make sure we get safe and effective products available to patients. So in 1977, in part to some very understandable concerns of the Thalidomide disaster, the Dalkon-Shield disaster. I didn't mention the DES, diethylstilbestrol disaster, causing cancer 20 years later in daughters exposed to DES in utero. These things made researchers really quite nervous about women. Women are weird. They might get pregnant. Oh my God, terrible things might happen. Before thalidomide, actually, it was thought that the placenta served as a barrier to any kind of toxins, the same way there's a blood-brain barrier. And so, it didn't matter what you ate, drank, or smoked. It was going to protect the developing fetus, and the children would be fine. Thalidomide kind of threw that on its head. It crossed the placenta, caused terrible deformities, similarly to DES. These are things that made the research community, which was burgeoning, just really kicking off in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s. NIH's growth, more research, more investment in the medical system. This really kicked off right at the time when people were really nervous about women. So FDA established a policy that said, no, women of childbearing potential should not be in the early studies. That would be the phase 1 or early phase 2 studies, when safety and toxicity are established and when early dosing levels are established. Now, they could be in the later patient studies, in the later phase 2 and phase 3 studies, if not excluded for other reasons, like age for cardiovascular disease. They could still be in them, but the dosing and early toxicity would not have been studied in women at all. And that bled over to studies funded by the NIH. It was not just FDA-regulated trials. It took took another 15 or so years before this changed. There was a lot of history in the middle, which I'm leaving out. But only in 1993 did FDA follow the NIH policy to say, yes, we do think it is safe to include and important to include women in clinical research studies at all phases. We're going to collect them. We want to collect and analyze data by sex differences, and we know that we can reduce the risk of fetal exposure through the proper protocol design, right? You can do pregnancy testing. You can ensure there's good contraceptive use. These are usually short studies, a week, 2 weeks, sometimes a little longer, but these early phases, phase 1 and early phase 2, are not necessarily long studies. So these things can be managed. And with good informed consent, you can ensure that we're not dealing with the risk of a fetal exposure. Of course, now, when the product gets out there in the real world, there will be fetal exposure, but that's another discussion of what we know and don't know about pregnant women. In any case, in 1993, FDA did change its policy, and it was following the NIH change in policy in 1990. Now, but we jump forward to today, where we know, for example, that cardiovascular disease is the number 1 killer of women in the United States. Yet, in a study done by ARC, they looked at mixed-sex cardiovascular disease trials. Only a third of them were women, and only a quarter of them reported their outcome by sex. So there's issues of including women and people of different races and ethnicities, and women of different races and ethnicities in the studies. And then there's the question of, do we analyze the data to look for it, to look for those differences? And indeed, the GAO had done an investigation back in 2001, which showed 8 of 10 drugs withdrawn from the market by the companies in response to safety concerns were due to a disproportionate effect on women. Either they were more often used in women, many diet products, for example, and therefore their adverse events showed up more often, or they actually had higher risks for women, no matter, even if they were taking these products in the same amounts. And these were products that were taken off the market. 8 of the 10 that had left the market in the previous decade. So there is some real issues around safety and efficacy that need to be considered, looking just at sex differences. Turns out that in this study, they went and looked at, again, by ARC, trying to do a review of the literature, and they found that they had to exclude 65% of all the papers they had found because the analysis didn't differentiate between men and women. And if we look over the last, 20-odd years, where these high bars here are the studies that did not include any data on women that were published in the literature, and here are the ones that did have data on women. You see, we had a huge increase in research on cardiovascular disease, but we've had no change, really, in how much that data is being analyzed for sex differences. And this is sort of this ending in 2011, starting in 1990. So we see this huge bolus of research, that these are all mixed sex. They did include women, but no one's analyzing it, right? I think that's a problem. So working with a number of folks in Boston at the Connors Center for Women's Health and Gender Biology and Kaiser Family Foundation and others, they held a summit and pulled together some strategies of what we need to be doing to make sure that we actually get data on sex differences and actually across demographic variables. Age, for example, many studies are done in younger populations, even though the product will be used in older populations, as well as race and ethnicity. And so we really need to have this action plan, starting with holding the agencies accountable. And again, these are agencies other than FDA, except we do think FDA must require adequate inclusion of women and meaningful analysis of data by sex differences and by sex crossed with race. I think we don't know about, Asian women and their response to medications for HPV, or whether there are, getting that sex crossed by race is just really, really hard, and we have to keep pushing on it. For example, as with pediatrics, there's labeling. If you don't have data on women or by race, ethnicity, then we need to put something on the label. I mean, this is very simplified, of course, but warning, safety and efficacy in women has not been established. If we can't get them, maybe that would be a motivation to go and get that data if your labeling had to say the data, it just isn't there. For example, we have a nutrition facts label, right? This is it's changing as we speak, I think. But we could have something similar for, labeling of a product that provides at least transparency to the fact of how many women were included, how many minorities participated, and of what type, and whether that data had been stratified by sex, and whether that was made any difference, whether that was presented to people. In 2012, with passage of the FDASIA, this is a version of the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, a few years back, there was a section of it, Section 907, which directed the FDA to publish and provide Congress a report that would address the extent to which clinical trial participation and the inclusion of safety and efficacy data by demographic subgroups, sex, age, race, and ethnicity is included into those applications submitted to the FDA. Indeed, FDA issued such a report about a year and a half later, in August of 14, and established an action plan. They reported on the problem in 13, and then in 14 came out with an action plan. And that action plan, one of the things I want to identify this for you, because it's a really useful tool, and it's something that you guys might want to go look at someday, drug trial snapshots. So what it is for newly approved drugs, like only in the last year or two. They're not going back, and they're only looking at the later phases of the studies. And I pulled the first drug on the list. It's a website you can go to, FDA Drug Snapshots. And it looks and it answers the questions and gives you some graphs on the drug and who was in their studies and what do we know about the differences. And I honestly just picked the first one. I didn't try and select anything in particular. So here, for this drug, were there any differences on how well it worked? Well, the studies that looked at the benefits were too small to determine if there were differences in sex, race, and age subgroups. So that was for efficacy, the benefits. Could we see anything? Well, the studies were actually too small. We can't tell. What about possible side effects? Well, the most common side effects were vomiting and nausea. There were some allergic reactions, and so forth in general. Well, were there any differences in the side effects among sex, race, and age? And so they said the subgroup analyses were conducted. And for side effects, it was similar in men and women, so points there for being able to have at least enough women in there and adverse events to be able to study that. The number of patients in the non-white subgroup, however, was limited, therefore differences among race could not be detected. And if we look at age, so for patients 65 and older was also limited, and therefore response above and below 65 years of age could not be determined. So they could do it on sex for adverse events only, not for benefits. Anything else, they couldn't tell you whether it worked differently or exactly the same between subpopulations. So that gets important because medications are often taken by people over 65, a lot of them, and amongst other younger patients, there's the same diversity as we have in the general population. So here's a sampling of the charts they provide again for this first drug, and we can see here they had 26% women, and so that was enough to look at adverse events, but not enough for benefits. They had nearly 60% white, nearly 30% Asian, 1 African American, come on, 1 American Indian or Alaska Native, and other unknown. We don't know. They didn't report. The data was not reported. If we look at the age, where we had, these are all the folks between 18 and 64, right? And then here are the folks 64 and 74 in red, and in green, the over 75s. So again, not enough to tell if there's a difference between these older populations and this large, younger population. So I think it's, again, and also in many of these studies, any other sort of comorbidities, any other conditions they might have, high blood, they might been ruled out. So these were patients who probably did not have as many other health problems as you might find in the general population, and it's part of the reason why elderly people are not always in there, because they often have other complicating health problems. So I want to point out a piece of legislation, the Research for All Act. This is being sponsored by Representative Cooper in the House. And this is actually trying to put in some requirements for FDA to ensure that products actually are studied in a wide variety of folks, by age, by sex, by race, ethnicity, and that there's a real need for this research. And the act, as sort of described, is it focuses on both NIH and FDA. And I think as we consider any new the biggest concern I have with expedited pathways and smaller, faster studies is that you are never going to have information on whether there are sex differences or differences by race, ethnicity, or by age in the product that's being sold. And we really need to know that information. For the more critical, pathways to have access to experimental products need to be expanded as experimental products, but not as approved products. Because once they're approved, as was mentioned earlier, the company may never come back with new data on safety and efficacy in a broad range of populations. But instead, we need access to products during the experimental phase, compassionate use, other expanded access pathways seem to be a very appropriate way to both be able to collect data and give access to patients, but not on the approval side. Once they're approved, We may never hear anything more about it until it's out there being marketed heavily to the entire population, not just the population that had been studied. So we need to strengthen FDA's ability to have oversight and make sure that any type of legislation focusing on further expediting pathways includes language that says, yes, you can have some priority, but you need to make sure you have this data at the same time. And I think I'm going to stop there. Any questions, comments?
So I have a question about your last slide. So when you think about personalized medicine, which is I think what you're talking about, right? And you established some of the early phases of personalized medicine, which is just gender and race differences. So when you think about this, the Research for All Act in particular, do you see it? And I see one of your slides talks about speeding new drugs to market. Could you just sort of talk through that a little bit? Because if it's one of those situations where more data leads to more time in collecting the data, does that in fact potentially slow an innovative product to be beneficial? Well,
I think we have to start back at the very design phase. It's not that you need to double your studies necessarily. You may need to increase the population a bit, but if you had just taken the populations, let's back up a bit here. If you'd had more women in this study, you'd have been able to assess better differences. If you'd had more older people in your study, you would have been able to do that. If you'd had different races and ethnicities in larger numbers, you might have been able to pull out some of the data using some of the same numbers you're not going to be able to shrink it down to 5-person studies or 10-person studies. Approving things early as opposed to allowing access to things early, which are, different pathways. Some of the things, it is to some degree not going to allow you to have the fastest, smallest studies to reach approval. And I would say that that's appropriate. We should have studies that are large enough and long enough to actually get the data we need. And faster without that data is not necessarily better.
Thanks, Susan. It's great to hear from you. And for the record, Susan was my first mentor in my career.
And now Libby tells me what to do.
As she wrote the Women's Health Equity Act. I think both from your days on the Hill and your days inside the agency and now in academia, I love what you would see as your top pieces of advice for advocates on how they can be smarter, more effective, particularly with organizations that may not have the resources that some of the industry has to really navigate the agencies and the Hill. And it's an open-ended question, but if you really could get them in a room and say, these are the things you really got to keep in mind as you look to PDUFA 6 or the...
We're going to have legislation before PDUFA 6, perhaps. Yeah. Well, it's a good question. I think there's both individual patients and patient organizations. We're looking at it from the patient perspective. I think the patients and patient organizations need to think of themselves not just as patients with a particular condition, but as consumers of medical products. And so these things are not contradictory at all. And sometimes we hear that there's a conflict between the consumer groups and the patient groups. And first of all, I'd say that there is no conflict, really. That I think everyone wants to make sure that there are products that are safe and effective. So keep having that collaborative mindset and thinking about the big picture as well as the specific picture of your particular health condition or patient organization. Coming to the agency when advocating, obviously with Congress, just be careful what you wish for. Going in and making sweeping changes in legislation, the devil is in the details of the bill. And so, for example, 21st Century Cures, as written, has a lot of devils in it. And if there's some great stuff in it for NIH, the stuff, it's no accident that some of those devils are in there. The language is written and come in, and if you aren't going to be reading the bill, because God knows it's a bear, then make sure that somebody is. Because there are things that are absolutely poison pills in there that need to be fixed, and it lowers the standards of FDA approvals, not just in fast or smaller, but in just like, you can lower the scientific standard to the floor if you want to, FDA. I mean, FDA will say it's not going to do that, but now if they got the authority to do that, the pressure would be on to lower the standard. So I think there are many things to watch. So having people who really look at those details, because it's really important. I think the other piece is that FDA is made up of people. So if you're talking to folks at the FDA, remember it's not just this thing, the FDA. It's made up of people who care and who are very mission driven and who want to do the best things, but are sometimes restricted and limited by what they can do. And so acknowledge that. Try to, again, you can try to fix the things that can be fixed, but be careful, again, what you wish for. So it's sort of a big balance there. And finally, pay attention to what are the interests of the public health and your health, and not just the interests of the manufacturers, because they have business interests. It's totally rational. I totally get it. But their interest may or may not be actually to get patients access to their medication before it's approved, because their motivation is to get it on the market where they can sell it to you and bill your insurance company. So think about it carefully when you look at expedited pathways, when in fact the battle, in my view, should be on broader access, and FDA has started to make it much more simpler from the FDA end. It's not FDA's being the barrier here. That expanded access to experimental products is a very reasonable way to get patient access while we still don't know if it really works or if it has very high risks. That, to me, is a more productive approach to ensuring access to patients. And I think you already know, human stories are the way to have an impact, and patient groups certainly are very skilled at bringing those human stories forward.
Hi, I have a question.
Sure.
Kind of going back to bringing in sex, men and women, as well as minority groups and age groups in the clinical trials. What would you say to researchers who say it's difficult to find those groups or get them into the clinical trials in the first place? Like, how would you address that recruitment strategy?
Okay, I'll try not to be flip. Okay. Yes, you can find people. Yes, you can. If you do it right, you can. That's what I would say to them. So, for example, this is the most recent example of the Flibanserin Approval, which is an all-female drug for libido, which was just approved by the FDA. In my view, wasn't ready for prime time. They were directed to do an alcohol study in the interaction of the drug, and did a study of 25 people, saw some adverse events indeed. Turns out, of those 25 people, 23 of them were men. And then they said they didn't think about it, restricting it only to women. Really? So I think there are, it's a bit of, in this day and age, yes, you have to make sure your trials, reach out to populations, build trust, overcome historic barriers, go to communities that you haven't historically gone to, perhaps. But that's all very doable. There's no reason. To me, in my view, there's really no reason why you can't find both the healthy volunteers you need at the beginning and the patient populations you need in the later phases. It might require a little bit of extra effort, but hey, it's a big project to get a drug through the drug approval process. It can be done.